Hello there. I'm Rachel Lee Nabors. You heard my introduction, so I'm not going to go on about it. The only addition I would make to that is that I work for this awesome startup now. All you need to know is that I'm leading developer education there. I love teaching. Hands up, how many people have heard of Clerk before? Okay, how many of you are using Clerk? Okay, well, I got stickers. You're welcome to come get them from me. Anyway, all you need to know about Clerk is that if you need user authentication at any point in the development work that you're doing, leave that to us and go make awesome things. Few of us want to grow up to become authentication experts. Unless you want to become an authentication expert, check Clerk out. So, moving along. I used to be on the React core team before this and a few other things. I spent my pandemic working on the React documentation site. And actually, I also spent it a little bit on did you just go back? My God, these clickers. There we go. Now, I'm also curious, how many of you visit React.dev? Raise your hands. Okay, sweet. All right. And how many of you didn't realize React.dev is the React docs? All right, good. We had a good show. Okay. Now, before the pandemic, in the long ago time, I was looking for a new role, and I was really interested in Vue. And I noticed a lot of the women in my community were getting into Vue and Ember because they felt like they identified with those communities. But I noticed that all the six-figure jobs needed React experience. And I was like, I tried to learn React many times, and I kept falling short. I never could really get past the Webpack configuration. And it's been like 3 hours doing that, and I still didn't have anything working. And I was just like, I don't understand this. And I was like, man, if only React were as easy to learn as Vue. More people like me would be getting six-figure jobs, and they'd be thought leaders, and they'd be amassing intergenerational wealth, and the world would be a better place, right? You know, like, that's a pretty cool lever to pull. So the next thing I did, was I was like, all right, I'm going to learn React. So I joined the React team in London in 2019 as a developer advocate / documentation engineer hybrid. Note to anyone in the audience considering joining large companies in hybrid roles, don't. It's just an HR nightmare when it comes to leveling and career ladders. Just make them pick a title for you and go with it. Anyway, my goal was to democratize React education for everyone so more people could get six-figure salaries, amass intergenerational wealth, and create the world that I wanted to live in. Thank you. So this is how I spent the pandemic. Ta-da. Built this with a few friends from the React community. Some who you may have heard of, some you may not have. I'll try to give them shout outs as we go along, but we only have so much time, and I'm a little behind schedule already. But as I joined Meta to work on React, which all my friends criticized me for because Meta is evil, but six-figure salaries for the masses, come on. Before I could work on React, Meta was like, first, spin all this straw into gold. That is to say, they said, turn around React Native's documentation first. Show us you can do the thing. I was like, well, okay. I didn't know anything about the React Native community. It's a mobile development community. It's not a front-end development community. The mobile development community, how many people here are mobile developers? Hello! Thank you for coming. We're all UI engineers. We are all equal, but that is not how the JavaScript and mobile engineering communities view each other. So I reached out and I was like, hi, friends. What do you want? And I learned some interesting things. More refresher material on React. So many people were coming into React Native and they did not know what React was. Something like 20%. I'll show you numbers. Additionally, they wanted more visual content. They wanted more in-depth content on specialized topics like security. And they wanted up-to-date component and API docs, which are kind of like your bread and butter of documentation. If your component and API docs are out of date, nobody can trust you. They wander off and do something else and won't look at you again for 2 years. True stories. And they wanted interactive code because if you ever spun up a mobile development environment, it takes a long time. So it's much nicer if you can just see the thing in the browser and then decide if that's the thing you want to move forward with before you commit to spinning up your environment. I ran some surveys and I learned some interesting facts. For instance, 41% of React Native developers do come from a mobile background, and they did not have React or JavaScript knowledge. So in the React Native docs, when it said, hey, you know, React Native is like React for native platforms, they'd be like, well, shoot, I guess I better go to the React docs. And then they look and React be like, React is a new JavaScript paradigm. They'd be like, well, shoot. And they'd go to the MDN docs and they'd start with learning JavaScript there. And I was like, well, shoot, that sounds terrible. So fixing for that, we built in literal context switchers to speak to learners' personal experiences, added a React refresher to help ramp people in who just didn't understand anything about React, and interactive code sandboxes courtesy of our friends at Expo. They created this lovely thing called a snack that you can embed on any website. And because the docs weren't built from source, they used to, but then they switched over to just Markdown, and people were still going and reading the old source code notes because they were better. It's sad. I ran a documentation drive with the community to sweep through and update all of those docs so that they would be correct and involved with source. Now, I even brought in some experts. I don't know if anyone here knows Caddy Kremen. She's one of my favorite London React developers. She's super awesome. She wrote our security documentation, brought in those experts from the community to help patch the missing documentation. And I added some colorful illustrations of my own that turned out to be pretty popular. React.dev launched July 23rd, 2020. Before this, it was like GitHub.io/Facebook/React. It was a long thing. It was very hard. So we started this .dev React convention with the launch of React.dev. So you can see the React docs story started all the way back with React Native. I love it. It's like two communities feeding into each other. This reboot lifted React Native's documentation rating by 70%. That's the number of people hitting thumbs up compared to thumbs down. So this is a pretty good lift. The whole effort took about 6 months total. There was no big bang. There was a blog post commemorating us getting to, it's good. I can move on to my next project. Now that I had proven the tenets, it was time to move on to React's documentation. And it kicked off on May 27th, 2020, at the start of the pandemic. This is actually a real photo from my Kurzgesagt mindfulness journal. It says that I played StarCraft at work. That was how we survived the pandemic in those days. We played StarCraft and kicked off the React educational materials reboot. Lovely. And like with React Native, I came in feeling like, well, I'm in the front-end community, but I bet there's a lot of things I don't know about this community. Why don't we run some surveys? I love running surveys. And the results were, of course, similar to React Native. That surprised me. I learned lots of things about non-educational things that were also surprising. For instance, more women maintained at this time legacy class-based components code bases compared to men, which I think says something about who's taking what jobs where. But anyway, data analysis aside, function components first. People were like, why are we learning about classes? Does React not believe in hooks? Why do we have to go through 3 layers of navigation to find this? You gotta know the secret password and do a little dance. And I'm like, yeah, you're right. There were no hook references. Use ref, you have to dive super deep to find out where the dependencies should go in that function. I remember being very confused about that. And I was right here next to the core team. And I'm like, what? Where shouldn't a robot be doing this? Thank goodness for compilers. More visual content, and of course, interactive code, which was kind of unheard of in these days. It was something you only really saw on courseware training sites. So one day, and I promise we followed the lockdown rules. This was during one of the intermissions where we were allowed to actually meet people. Dan and I met up, Dan Abramov, that is, and we started doodling. Most of our conversations between Dan and I came about as doodles. And because of this, I made a new friend named ReactHead. ReactHead shows up in my doodles. I used to he was inspired by IKEA, so I'd be like, Dan, is this how state works? Okay, hang on. Dan, is this how state works? And this was how we communicated. And some of these visual metaphors ended up being canonized, and I inked them. You can see my cartooning background. And they live in the React docs to this day, hopefully making it easier to understand the React paradigms through clever metaphors. But the effort also culminated in a huge spreadsheet of new content that needed to be made. If this looks weird to you, this is how all books get written. The content for React.dev was very different from React.native.dev. React.native.dev reorganized the content that was already there, edited it, modified it. React.dev was 100% greenfield, burned down project. Oy. So we weren't editing what was there. We were building essentially a new book, and books take years to write. We went to beta December 8th, 2020. This was when we officially started sharing with the community, launched with lots of fun illustrations, like I said, and a diagramming system by Maggie Appleton, another London resident you may have heard of, who's super cool, although less active in the React community these days. Anyway, Maggie did an amazing job of translating my awful doodles into these much better diagrams, and I think they're a lot easier for people to understand. There are also interactive sandboxes made using Code Sandbox. These were a real game changer, so much so when I first showed people demos of this site, they didn't realize they were editable. We had to make a few tweaks to make them look more like code editors because there were subtle, people thought they were like screenshots of code. It was hilarious. But good to see people have those aha moments when they started figuring out how it works. We also implemented something called retrieval practice. So you show that cramming information doesn't work. What makes new knowledge really stick is there's this book called Make It Stick, and it boils down to TLDR, practice that's spaced out, interleaved with other learning, and varied produces better mastery, longer retention, and more versatility. This is a nice way of saying all those pop quizzes your teacher gave you in school served a purpose. By making you quickly recall and use information, it wired the neurons in your brain. This is why the wonderful engineers I worked with at Meta could just look at the code on the screen, blur their eyes a little, and guess from the pattern what it was doing, because they'd had so many instances of reviewing that code at the last minute, at late nights, etc. They'd retrieved it so many times that it was boiled into their brain meat, so to speak. So we wanted to recreate that experience of having worked at a company and troubleshooted React code yourself into the docs directly. And that's what the sandboxes let us do. We shipped these little challenges, which really make the difference. Dan made most of these. And it's like having Dan sit there and be like, well, that's not quite right, to any solution you might come up with. These are non-blocking. You don't have to complete them to move through the documentation. But most people in user testing wanted to complete each of them because they were fun. But how did we know that any of this was actually working? Well, we asked real people. In alpha testing, yes, that's right, alpha testing. I used to be a UX person. I would invite people from the community to come in and look at the docs, but first they had to fill out a survey. And then when they were done looking at the survey, they had to, the documentation, they had to fill out another survey. And between the first survey and the second Thursday, testing participants were 3 times more likely to recommend the new documentation to the old. Huzzah! So March 16th, 2023, the docs were mission complete. The tutorial had been added, the API references were completed, and it was ready to stop being a little banner across the top of ReactJS.org and start being React.dev. ReactJS.org still exists at legacy.reactjs.org. So those of you who are still working with classes, you can still find it. It's still there. It's not going to be updated or maintained unless there's some horrible doomsday security flaw or something, which isn't likely because it's just React. Come on. But it's still there. It's not going anywhere. But this is the new home with the new landing page, the React.dev. It has over 600 interactive examples. That's a testament to Dan's hard work. It also has examples that are written with an international audience in mind. I want to thank Sylvia Vargas, who's not here tonight, but she was one of the early community contributors who helped overwrite all of our kitten-based examples with ones that celebrate humanity's finest achievements, that is to say, cities, art, poets, etc. No Star Wars references. We are not in the habit of exporting American pop culture to the rest of the world on React Core. Facebook might do that, but not React. All right. But I want to point out that all of these things, the illustrations, the sandboxes, they were trialed in React Native's documentation. This is how we understood what was working and that we had a good idea that these same techniques were going to work for the 10 times larger audience of the React community. And the interesting thing is, these went on to change how we approached React. And the React community helped us realize those changes at a scale that we wouldn't have been able to in the past. 8 million learners had access to these docs during the beta, and now everyone does. I hope that they help you in your React journey, and that we have more people from more backgrounds coming in and teaching and practicing React. If you want to talk about developer education, please come say hi. I did bring some stickers. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Rachel. Impressive. And we are eternally grateful for this because we can now have some good resources to look at when we have any doubt. So is there anyone in the audience that wants to make a question? Oh, nice. Can we get a micro to Ellen, please? Right here.
Yeah. So the question is not about React.dev, it's about your experience. At New Day, we suffer from documentation. We have a big problem. We have lots of documentation and we cannot find what we want. We know that we have to fix it. We don't know how. Can you give me a secret that I can apply and it's going to solve our problem? Or it can give me my first step.
Well, documentation is a really tricky problem. I actually find it's how do I put this? Like, I've worked with large-scale documentation engineers and technical writers, and I have my own opinions. They aren't going to work everywhere. Right now, I work at a startup, and my spinning straw into gold at the startup is fix all this documentation. But it's a very different problem from the scaling documentation problems we had at AWS and the open source documentation problems we had on the React teams. Each docs problem is a new problem. It's like fighting a new battle. I should use fewer military metaphors. I struggle. My family was a military family. But there are some different things you can do. Number one, you can hire some professional technical writers and documentation leaders. Like, that always helps. Number two, you could say, well, we should use DITA. If you've got like an IBM-sized pile of content, DITA, I forget what it stands for. It's like DITA. But the idea is basically you saw all of your information, and it's like dry for docs. It's super dry. You extract all the core concepts and the tutorials and all these things into little pieces, and then when you need to launch new documentation, you just zip it up and compile it on the fly. And it's used for things like owner manuals for Samsung, because they got to generate a lot of them and update a lot of them. That's like a mammoth scale. For people who are working at smaller scales, you typically want to go with something called diataxis. It basically breaks down, this isn't a longer version of the talk, but it breaks down all documents into like 4 flavors, starting with API references, then guides that show how to use the different references with each other, then tutorials, which will help people build something, and there's a defined outcome, step, and then finally conceptual overviews, which is where you sit Dan Abramov down and say, no, tell me really, how does state work? And you write that down. So there's a couple of different approaches, but baking documentation processes into your support mechanisms, as well as your engineering release processes, is the first step. Also, conducting a very thorough content audit and sweep is something that you should do anytime someone is coming in to take over a documentation code base, or as I call it, the doc space. It was like a really loaded question. You gotta ask softer ones.
Any more questions from the audience? Oh, here we go.
What's your favorite part of that process? You talked about like various different parts about it. What's your favorite part that you really enjoyed, and why?
Reading the feedback. I love it because every time we come to a page I've worked on, feedback's like, it's amazing. Even if my name isn't on it, I'm just like, yes, it's amazing. Yep, that's why you paid. But no, I'm kidding. Actually, it is metrics. I like following the metrics because if you have your metrics set up for your docs, I'm a big metrics person, not just around docs, but around products in general. I have like a fail state where I know something isn't working for just about everything I do, including having a party. Like, fewer than 3 people RSVP'd, it's a fail state, cancel it. Like, how will I know that the new Google Home is a success with my family? I'll know because my partner is going to stop using their Bluetooth microphone. I mean, like that sort of thing. And with docs, it's good to see like a certain level of bounces on API references combined with copy paste. So if people come in, they quickly copy something and they leave the site, that's a success case for an API reference. And I love looking at a dashboard and being like, yes, the heartbeat of the documentation is good, all is well, nothing is on fire. That's the part I enjoy. The second part I enjoy is actually getting to talk with really cool engineers and coming in sort of like with a big vacuum and being like, all right, open wide, we're going to get this out of your head now. And we're going to get it into everyone else's head. I think like the things that I like doing the most is taking information from one engineer's mind and unlocking it into many other minds so that that information is no longer privileged or arcane. Everything is easy to understand if you break it down enough. I actually love ChatGPT for this because it's like having a big brother. They're not always right, or a big sister, but you can ask them to explain hard things over and over again. I'm kind of excited about where we could go with educational tools in the future using these new tools. I don't think they answer everything, but like I said, just getting the information from one person to everyone is still quite cumbersome. And with technical topics, we still have quite a bit of ways to go before we can just make it as instantaneous as playing a movie.
Thank you so much. That was great.
Talking about good feedback, I have good feedback here that I'm going to read to you, which is not a question, more like a gratitude. React.dev helped me understand React and hooks better. React.dev is truly great for learning. So, well done.
I'm glad to hear that. That's great.
And talking about ChatGPT, do you think AI will replace writing?
I mean, come on. I specialize in getting people's ideas on paper. AI still struggles just as badly as humans do. You're always going to need editors. Will editors be paid as well as others? I mean, this is genuinely a question. You know, the strikes with the film artist guilds that's happening right now. It's not film artist guild. It's like whatever. Sorry. The strikes in Hollywood right now are essentially around, is AI going to write scripts and then humans are going to be paid less to edit them? And I got to say, if you've looked at many Hollywood movies, you're like, yeah, these definitely feel like they were written by a bot. They're all the same. I mean, you show me something new that someone's... I see this as a challenge for humans to try harder, but it's a real question. You know, what if we could just replace tech writers with bots? But if you've ever met a tech writer, and I've met many tech writers in my career, I don't consider myself a tech writer any more than a developer advocate, as I've never actually had that title. But I've met enough of them that I know the complaint is always, there's not enough of us. We can't keep up with the workload. All of this documentation is rotting and we don't know how to manage it. And I'm like, well, if we could just build the power tools and like put them in like a mecha suit so they could like run analysis across the docs and go in and like do point-based changes and generate the examples from source code, if we could just give them those tools, they could do their jobs and not burn out. So I think yes and no. Will the bots replace writers? Yes. Will they replace the really hard editorial parts that only humans can do? Not in the near future. Somebody still has to set the system up and somebody still has to curate it and grow it and guide it. So I'm hoping for more like the mecha suit future, where people who are burning out are actually able to do their jobs and feel good about it and ship something that isn't keeping them up at night, or they're constantly feeling like they're battling a fail state. And less that people will be replaced entirely, which I think is foolish, and you will definitely ship what you invest in.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Is this working? Do we have room for a couple more questions? Are you up for it?
I am. I thought you were shooing me off stage there. Yeah, I'll keep talking.
We're running a bit late, but I think we can run 5 minutes late. Just a couple more. So there's another question here from the audience. Tutorials usually don't come with test suites. Thought production-ready code needs testing. Can TDD approach be used as a learning practice for React?
I love that. And I'm going to reiterate what I think I heard there, which was the examples that we see in tutorials are very rarely run through test suites like a person might develop in the wild. Well, there was actually a create React, and I'm forgetting the URL name, but Jad Jorban, who I knew from my time in Amsterdam, made this really lovely interactive React tutorial that literally had you working through a code base and tests running, and you could only advance to the next part of the tutorial if you got one of the tests to pass. I really enjoyed that. It was beyond the technical implementation scope of the documentation, but I do think that there is room in the educational market for more methodology like that. It's just usually outside the budget of the teams that take on things like documentation.
Which are the toughest pages to build for React.dev? How did you and the team push through it?
Well, honestly, I think the hardest part was use refs. And Dan's not here to talk about it, but Dan tackled that one for a very long time. It's because React still doesn't do everything perfectly or well. And so there are a lot of escape hatches and foot guns that have to be explained. And I personally found that the level of explanations that we had to go through to make it grokkable felt like doing backflips, to the point where I started to question if React was really creating a better developer experience, or if it was a good developer experience up to a point and then it just became gymnastics. Those were the hardest, and I really have to commend Dan for pushing through. I think it really helped to run the documentation, the various essays, through internal audiences and then through external ones, to slowly finesse it to a scope and metaphor and a level of detail that would work for the community.
Thank you. Any more questions? Oh, we have one more. Can we? I need to ask my boss. Vic, can we have one more? Yeah? Okay, good.
Thank you for making React.dev. I personally find it very useful, and I basically look at it every day. So my question is, so now React.dev is open source. How do you deal with the different kinds of contributions, people opinions on what should be in there, type of guides or corrections, etc.? Like one example is the React ecosystem is so vast. So people might add guide for this, guide for that, like even just at the integration levels. And how do you decide, okay, I'll accept this one or that one, or just, something like that?
That's a good question. Now, it should be mentioned, I no longer maintain those documents. I have moved on to other challenging educational issues at other companies. So the React team is managing them, and I can't speak to their practices at this time. I know that it was always a bit of a struggle because the number one of pull requests we would get or issues we'd get on React stocks were, can you link to my course? Or can you link to this popular blog post I like that explains things in a way that's not sanctioned by the React core team because it's fundamentally flawed on some level? We'd get those a lot, and it was always like, what do we do with this? What label do we want to have for, like, we see you, but we can't. I don't think we ever came up with a label for that. But all open source teams have a label for that. The trick is to figure out what it is. But for me on the projects I've worked on, what I try to do is workshop with community members who are using the actual product and the people who are working in support or on product to find out what the major use cases for the thing are. What are people trying to do? Where are they getting stuck? And then from this, create kind of a golden path roadmap for the content and try to hang the content off of that path, as opposed to just when I usually come into a doc space, it's like somebody just dumped things into the package, or they just, like, a bunch of people were creating guides and they just threw them in and hoped that they would land well. But a well-groomed doc space has a flow, a learning path, a lot like the one you saw with React compared to the one with React Native, which was more of a gardened learning path. The React learning path was very deliberate, and the lessons and the guides hung off of it with a very deliberate scope. I'm also a big believer in going with a nonlinear learning path because most people land on pages as they need them. And this is where the React docs go with a linear path. You kind of have to start at one end and work your way to the other. It's a little bit less dippable for reference, except for the API references themselves or the books references, as it were. But I like to make sure that each guide can stand alone. So if somebody's, for instance, with Clerk, just like, I want to add a sign-up form to my site, how do I do that? They don't have to go through an entire tutorial to understand the thought processes behind Clerk and how you should think about authentication. Like there's going to be material for that somewhere. But some people just want to get a job done. And usually documentation needs to be organized around that. So whenever people are making a contribution, the number one question to ask in that template is, what job is this doing for the person who's going to read this guide? Oftentimes, contributions are rehashes of existing content, or they are essays that have a nugget of something really useful in them, and your job as the person accepting that contribution is to work with the author to carve that nugget out and put it into a format that makes it easily digestible and consumable by the learner, rather than something they must endure.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel, so much. I think we need to close it for tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me.